Today. Thank you. Well, hello, welcome back. The speaker today has this cheery title, but he's very cheery. This is Dr. Les Thiele. He's a distinguished professor in the Department of Political Science at UF. He received his undergraduate degree from McGill University and his PhD from Princeton in political science. And he came to the University of Florida in 1991. He's published 9 books, including one this year on sustainability and another recently on the art and craft of political theory. So he's director of the Center for Adaptive Innovation, Resilience, Ethics, and Science, and oversees an active learning program for experiential education of undergraduates. He focuses on political thought, sustainability, emerging technologies, and the intersection of political philosophy and natural sciences. And his central concerns are the responsibilities of citizenship and the opportunities for leadership in a world of rapid technological, social, and ecological change, which makes him very appropriate for this course. So today he's going to talk about the politics of sustainability, collective action in an age of despair.
Thanks, Jane. Is this on? Yeah? Okay. Thank you. So, should I be walking forward so I'm in the camera, or does that not matter? Okay, so we don't need to worry about the camera. Excellent. So, I'll just spend a moment talking about the title of this and where it comes from. And it's something I spend some time talking about with my students because their generation is the first generation, or maybe almost the second generation, where they know they're not going to do as well as their parents. And that's a new one for Americans. They realize this. They're one of the first generations who grew up with an understanding that climate change is radically going to impact, if not their lives, then the lives of their children, and not for the better. And amongst these students, there's a fair bit. It goes by different names, different terms. Sometimes it's called eco-anxiety. Sometimes it's called climate despair. Sometimes it's called climate anxiety. But really, if you imagine yourself as a young undergraduate or high school student, and from very early age, you've become aware that the world may not look like the world of your parents or grandparents, that you have no way of predicting what that world is going to look like, that it could be significantly worse. And here's the rub, is it's such a big problem, such a global problem, that it's not really clear what you can or should do about it. And so that, I would say, contributes heavily to the age of despair for the students that are entering UF these days. There's other contributing factors, more recent ones, and we were talking about this at lunch, but the arrival of large language models, AI, and digital technology has radically transformed the world for these students. For them, there's a lot of good parts to that. They live on social media, they like the instant access and all that sort of thing. But they're also aware that automation and AI is going to be taking away a lot of opportunities, maybe presenting some others, but certainly taking away some opportunities for them in the job market. And it's not clear to them what it means to become knowledgeable and skilled when the future is going to have ever more powerful artificial intelligence that is going to be more knowledgeable and skilled than they can possibly be. So that's also a part, I think, of the despair that comes in, despair being not having a sense of agency, not having a sense that you're in charge of your life. Um, and, there's also this phenomenon of what's been called deaths of despair, um, sharply rising suicide rates, overdose deaths, cardiovascular disease from people that aren't taking care of themselves in terms of their eating. That's at an all-time high within the general population, not among students in particular. Although with students, there's also trends where we want to look at this and obviously be concerned. Um, and so there's a sense in which it's legitimate to talk about today as an age of despair, at least for many people. So that's the background. Why get involved in politics in an age of despair? So I teach courses to students on sustainability and politics. And given the background they have and the feelings they have, they're concerned, but they're not exactly clear what they can or should do about it. The job falls to me to try to suggest to them that political engagement is a good thing for them to do. It's one of the only things that's going to actually help us see around some of the corners and solve some of the dire problems we have. Um, but, their understanding of politics is not necessarily that it's a good thing. There's a long tradition in America of looking at politics as a dirty business. And it still is very much a dirty business, and a lot of students are turned off from it. But I try to suggest that it's the only means, and I think Reinhold Niebuhr, he was a theological thinker from some time ago, put it well where he said, our capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but our inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. And not just democracy in the sense of institutions, but active engagement in democratic processes. And Bernard Crick, he was a political theorist who observed that eternal vigilance, and here I'd want to suggest that vigilance is more than just reading the newspaper every day. It's doing that and getting involved is the price that you need to pay for democracy and liberty. So what does it take to become part of the solution rather than part of the problem? And here I'll mostly talk about part of the problem in terms of environmental problems, climate change, issues like that. But the same arguments would go for if you're going to be if you want to be part of the solution regarding the digital transformation rather than part of that problem. The problems that go along with that are misinformation and all that sort of stuff, distraction, so forth. So it takes political engagement. That means not being a bystander. Does anybody know where this quote comes from? It's actually at the it's in an entrance to a museum in Washington, D.C. Any guesses which museum that is? It's the Holocaust Museum. And that's the consequences of bystanding, not just in the European Holocaust, but other sorts of things that have happened over time. Niemöller was a Protestant pastor, and he, I think, has the most powerful quote on that. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak up because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came to me, and there was no one left to speak up for me. And he spent the last part of his life in a Nazi concentration camp. So it was a very personal belief, not just an observation for him. The guy at the top, you guys know well, and he had the same idea in mind where he said, the person who does many things makes mistakes, but he doesn't make the biggest mistake, which is doing nothing. So I try to get that across to students in an age of despair. With regards to sustainability in general, Lester Brown's one of the more prominent thinkers in this. He's no longer writing, but certainly in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, he was very prominent. And he points out that from a sustainability point of view, saving civilization isn't a spectator sport. And I like Swan's notion as well that the greatest threat to our planet is the belief that somebody else is going to figure out how to save it or how to solve some of the problems that we face. Many believe that active engagement in environmental concerns and in sustainability means you just have to be a conscious consumer. So you put your recycling out, you try not to buy too many plastic items, maybe you buy organic food, um, maybe you drive a hybrid car, or you try to walk or ride your bicycle so you don't put too much carbon in the air. All those things are important. But I think that the idea that we can achieve the things we need to achieve to solve some of the problems we need to solve can be achieved by us as individuals and individual consumers is misbegotten. Much more is needed, and that is going to be political action. Trying to do our job just as consumers would be like going out and picking out the trash in front of oil refineries while ignoring the large problems that are being faced in terms of climate change, for instance. This is a well-worn phrase for environmentalists in general and people concerned with sustainability. It's important to change your light bulbs, but first change your politicians, or here, first change your laws. You know, that we don't use many of these now. The compact fluorescents, LEDs have taken over, and they're even more efficient than compact fluorescents. But the idea of getting rid of incandescents and putting in either compact fluorescent or an LED to save electricity, which reduces the amount of carbon going in the air, that's a good idea. But even more important is changing the politicians who aren't going to be part of the solution, or changing the laws that make it more difficult to develop solutions. And I spoke to Charlie Garlow. He was an EPA attorney for many years. And he was pointed out that he does both. He's a conscious consumer, but to the extent that he has any hope, it comes from people going beyond that action as individual consumers and getting involved in changing laws and politicians. So, you know, at some level, maybe I've got an audience here that doesn't need much convincing of the benefits of our acting sustainably and dealing with climate change and trying to solve these problems. So the question may arise in your mind, like, you know, if you're going to get in the political fight, who are you fighting against? Who's opposed to something like sustainability, which is like motherhood and apple pie? Who could object to it? Well, you know, a lot of people out there. Here's a group that talks about the green mask in reference to sustainability, with the understanding that people who advocate for sustainability are the same sort of people that advocate for the United Nations kind of ruling the world and the black helicopters coming out and running our lives. And you know, you can, these are some of the quotes. If you go to these sites and you read what people say, Agenda 21 is a United Nations agreement that deals with trying to make the world more sustainable. And you can see that they see it, some people see sustainability as evil, some people see it as un-American, as a threat to our liberties. So there's certainly people that are opposed to it. Something called the Post-Sustainability Institute that comes from the same idea. It's against United Nations alliances with non-governmental groups who want to erect communitarianism as a dominant form of world governance. So you could say that this is kind of a radical take on it, that there's a lot of good reasons to question some of the approaches that people who are advocates of sustainability take, and I think there are. I think we have to look at things with a critical eye. But clearly, there are political battles to be fought as well out there. The us versus them idea, that's key to politics in many respects, and we see it around us today all the time. And sometimes that's us as idealists versus realists. You know, people might think, well, sure, it would be nice if, you know, we all ate the right foods and had electric transport and all this sort of stuff, but the reality of it is that's not going to happen. And so they see sustainability as kind of pie in the sky. Um, Garrett Hardin was a biologist, actually. He's very famous for this idea, the tragedy of the commons. I'll talk a little bit about that later. And he had the cardinal rule of realism, never ask a person to act against his own self-interest. And so, you know, sustainability presumably asks people to act against their own self-interest, to care for future generations or the planet. And that, Hardin wanted to say, goes against his rule of realism. He came out with something called lifeboat ethics. And the idea was quite simple and quite powerful. The idea is that we, humanity, or certain nations, certain parts of nations, are really in the position of people in a lifeboat, in rough waters. And unfortunately, the way the world is there's a lot of people in the water, and they all want to get in our lifeboat. And then we're faced with a choice. Do we let them get in, or do we push them off with the oars and let them meet their fate in these roiling waters? And Hardin wanted to say, you know, you have to take the hard, realistic stance and understand that if you let everybody in the lifeboat sinks and nobody survives. So his approach is to say you have to take care of yourself. There's not enough to go around in this world. And that's just the tragedy of the situation we live in. Some people are going to suffer. I'm not going to show you this talk, but I'll recommend it for you. He died recently, Hans Rosling. He was a statistician and a great thinker. And he has a lovely graphic of this, but I'll tell you what the gist of it was for him. He points out that if you're concerned with too many people out there in the water floating around wanting to come in your lifeboat, then what you'd want to do is really reduce population and make sure that there's not as many people out there that need resources to go around. So he asks the question, well, what's the best way to reduce population? And the science on that is very clear. There's two ways that population can be most effectively reduced. One is to provide people with adequate health care, and the other is to ensure that women get an education and have job opportunities. Because when people have adequate health care, they don't produce more children to take care of them in their old age, because most of their children, they assume, rightfully, may die when they're very young. And opportunities for women mean that women aren't only or primarily the bearers of children, but they are people with educations and opportunities, and they want to pursue some of that, so the fertility rate goes down as well. So Hardin would, for instance, talk about the fact that if, he was often against programs which would provide food to people when there was famine, and his lifeboat approach was, if you're giving them food is just sharing resources among people, that's just going to have them produce more babies, and then we'll need more food, and then eventually the lifeboat gets sunk. And Rosling points out that what you really need to do, it's not about giving food aid, it's about ensuring that people have opportunity. Because when they have opportunity, that turns out, the facts are in, the fertility rate goes down. And then there's less people that have to clamber into the lifeboat. So that's just to suggest that we can bring science and social science to bear on some of these problems. And the graphic images we might have out there, like the lifeboat choice, is a false choice for us. We don't have to be shoving people away with the oars. Rather, we can be providing them with opportunities and education. Um, so I mentioned Hardin came up with this notion of the tragedy of the commons. That's also a very powerful metaphor. Um, and the idea, how many here have heard of the tragedy of the commons? A number of people. It's pretty simple and kind of straightforward. The idea is, so in England, there were these areas called commons, pasture lands, and anybody could graze their livestock on these commons areas. And so Hardin said, well, how's that going to work? If I'm an individual rancher, or I have a sheep farm or something, my incentive, because I'm going to follow my own self-interest, is to bring my sheep to graze on the commons. Of course, I'm not the only one doing that. Everybody's doing that. And my self-interest would be to put as many of my sheep on the commons because it's free pasture land. And he says that's everyone else's incentive. So what happens is everybody puts their sheep and cattle on the commons. The commons is grazed down to a hard scrabble, and then it stops growing grass, just gets trampled on. And eventually there's nothing on the commons any of our animals can eat. And our animals all starve and we all starve. Hence the tragedy of the commons. And a lot of people kind of bought into this idea with the idea that you really have two choices. You can have kind of a world government that makes rules for everybody to make sure that they don't do this, or you can have kind of private enterprise, a complete market system that everybody just takes care of their own plot of land and doesn't let anyone else on it. And then this person came along, Eleanor Ostrom, and she wrote something called Governing the Commons. And she did good social science to prove that there are actually many commons areas around the world that are adequately governed without a central government, and not in the sense of there's just private property. You have fishermen that govern traditionally fishing areas around their coasts. You have grazers who effectively govern commons. But she found that there were things that needed to happen. You had to have clear rules of proper behavior. You had to have strict monitoring and enforcement based on local ties and trust. And you had to have a widespread awareness of both individual and collective self-interest. And when you had all those things, people could and did well manage their commons over many, many, many generations in a way that sustained the commons, sustained the environment, and sustained their lifestyles. So here I'm just pointing to, Hardin came up with two big images, lifeboat ethics and the tragedy of the commons. But it turns out in real life, not just the life of powerful metaphors, that it doesn't have to be a lifeboat ethics type choice, and that commons can be sustainably managed if you go about it the right way. um, Cooperation to protect the commons is grounded on transparency, that is to say, clear rules and clear penalties for violating those rules. Just some signs of how this sometimes happen. Fred Krupp runs one of the large nonprofit groups called the Environmental Defense Fund. I won't show you this, but he just they use satellites around the globe to monitor carbon emissions that are coming out of natural gas plants and that sort of stuff. Because without that data, we don't know when there are violations. We don't have the transparency we need to actually achieve the things we want. Lots of stuff going on where you have efforts of independent greenhouse gas tracking that needs to go on in order to find out, where the problems are occurring. So that's just to suggest that, one of the things that Ostrom said we need, which is transparency, clear rules, and clear ways of enforcing them. Technology can sometimes help. Politics has to do the rest of the job there. The other side of it is a clear sense of both collective and individual interest. Collective and individual interest. Because, we're all individuals and we care for ourselves and our families. That's just the way we're constructed biologically. But having a sense of collective interest is important because we're in a collective situation. This is an image of what's sometimes called spaceship Earth. And it's really the global commons. Adlai Stevenson was a American politician and administrator in a number of American administrations in the 50s and 60s. And he made this notion famous, the notion of spaceship Earth. We travel together, passengers on a little spaceship, dependent upon its vulnerable reserve of air and soil, all committed for our safety to its security and peace, preserved from annihilation by the care, work, and I will say, the love we give our fragile craft. So again, this is in, I think, the early 60s, and that's kind of the dawning of an age of an understanding of how the fates of nations are tied together in an environmental sense. President Johnson was the first president to actually get a white paper created that outlined the dangers of climate change. This was back in 1965 when the scientists first understood that. Obviously, action wasn't taken, but you get the sense that, for over half a century, we've had this sense of the global spaceship. This is a famous line that Stevenson said. This is how his speech continued, and this is not as well recognized. But basically, here Stevenson is saying that a lot of it, caring for that spaceship, is going to entail making sure that people on that spaceship are relatively equitably and justly treated. Because the spaceship is not going to survive if you're half free and half slave, and if you have these vast contradictions. So how do we expand people's sense of self-interest so that they graduate to having both self-interest and a sense of collective interest? Gaylord Nelson, he's the senator from Wisconsin who first started the first Earth Day back in 1970, and pointed out that, the ultimate test of our conscience is, are we willing to sacrifice something for ourselves that's going to benefit a future generation whose thanks we're never going to hear? Because sometimes it's easy to do things if someone is going to be right there to thank you for it. And that's part of it. How do we extend our temporal horizon, our sense of time, so it crosses generations? I like Ernest Partridge's approach to this, where he points out that the welfare of posterity allows us to identify with larger processes and projects. And in the absence of that breadth of vision, our lives would be empty, bleak, pointless, and morally impoverished. So Partridge is saying, having a concern for future generations and as well for the fates of other people on the other side of the globe, whose actions impact your actions in an age of global interdependence. That's pragmatic, but it's also moral. And more than just moral, it satisfies our self-interest in the sense of it gives our life some sense and purpose. Partridge was saying, if you're only concerned with the narrowest of narrow self-interest, what's the point? We're all going to die. If we don't contribute something larger than ourselves, it's a futile effort. Okay, well, that doesn't, so that suggests why we can think big picture, why we should be concerned with the big picture, why it makes sense from both a self-interest and collective point of view. But these are big ass problems, climate change. Like, how do we start to get involved in that when the problem seems so large at a scale that we can't handle? And that can leave us feeling hopeless. This goes back to that eco-anxiety or climate despair I talked about earlier. So the question is, can individuals make meaningful contributions to sustainable solutions in the face of these large-scale problems? And that's the question my students most want me to provide an answer for. They understand the problems. They understand the scale of the problems. They have the anxiety. What they don't know is whether it makes at all sense to think of themselves as contributing in a way that's going to make a useful contribution. And so I'm a social scientist, so here some of the social science comes to bear. Vilfredo Pareto was a sociologist in the 1800s, and he came up with this notion of what was called the Pareto principle, or it's sometimes called the principle of the vital few, or the 80-20 rule. He was just sort of going over statistics and facts, and he found out that 80% of the land in Italy at the time was owned by 20% of the population. He thought that was interesting, and then he started exploring a few more things in the area of economics and sociology, and he found this ratio of 80-20 kept coming up again and again and again. And other people have followed suit. So here's some examples. 80% of the income is generally in most countries earned by 20% of the population. 80% of the profits of a company come from 20% of its customers. 80% of the complaints also come from 20% of the customers. Sales come from 20% of the profits. Injuries come from 20% of the hazards. And in your personal life, 20% of the people you know will provide 80% of your companionship. 20% of your time will provide 80% of your enjoyment. 20% of your problems cause 80% of your stress. You wear 20% of your clothes 80% of the time. And you listen to 20% of your music 80% of your time. Generally, 80% of all effects come from 20% of causes. The 80-20 rule, the principle of the vital few. Well, this is helpful. Let me give you an example of somebody who effectively incorporated the 80-20 rule, but he never actually speaks of it. You guys know who this is? Buckminster Fuller. Yeah, Bucky, as he was known. He came up with the notion of the geodesic dome. He was a real forward thinker. He has this on his, this is his gravesite. Call me trim tab. That is a trim tab. This is what he said. Something hit me hard very once thinking about what one man could do. Think of the Queen Mary, the ship. The whole ship goes by, and then comes the rudder. And there's this tiny thing on the edge of the rudder called the trim tab. It's a miniature rudder. Just moving the little trim tab builds a low pressure that pulls the rudder around, takes almost no effort at all. So I said an individual can be a trim tab. So I think I have another picture of that. Yeah, there's the trim tab, really small. And you have trim tabs on airplanes too. A trim tab comes up and it creates kind of a low pressure, and that moves the rudder around. And when the rudder moves around, the ship moves around. So you've got, 80% being moved by probably less than 20% here. And Buckminster Fuller, who was this progressive thinker who had an oversized influence on the world, thought of himself as a trim tab. Donella Meadows has a great book about thinking in systems, and she talks about leverage points. Same idea with the leverage point. You can move a big thing if you have a large lever. The first person to come up with that was Archimedes, who said, give me a place to stand on and I can move the earth if you have a large enough lever. Again, it's the notion of a trim tab or a leverage point that allows you to do things outside of what you'd expect to be possible by an individual. So So you only need 20% of a population to make significant change. And that may seem like a lot, 20% of population. I mean, the United States is whatever it is, 300 and something million. That's a big size of the population. But you likely need less, because you could think of it this way. You need 20% of the population, but how do you get that 20% of the population active? Well, you don't need the whole 20%. You really just need 20% of the 20% to get that 20% active that then gets the rest active. You get the 20% of the 20% active. You don't need all of them, you just need 20% of them, okay? So you can run that all the way down till it gets to be a small number of people. Here's for college students. Does anybody know who these are? Here are their names. They went to North Carolina's Agriculture and Technical College. They were the vital few, the trim tabs. In 1960s, they sat at a lunch counter at a Woolworths that only allowed whites to sit there, and they refused to move. The press came later that day and the next day, and the Greensboro Four returned. They brought some of their friends. Sit-in spread to other colleges. Later that year, they formed the Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, organized the Freedom Rides, and later on, Martin Luther King had his historic march in Washington where he gave his I Have a Dream speech. That's in '63. And then it's not too long after that that there's Johnson signing the Civil Rights Law into action. And the former Woolworths, where they sat, now is a museum, and the lunch counter is at the Smithsonian, if you want to take a look at it. So that's the vital few that grows. And in the class, I provide an example of how you really would only need, 20% of a class or 20% of 20% of a class to start something off where it could rise to bigger and greater things. Bobby Kennedy had the same idea. He has this brilliant speech where he talks about what seems to be South Africa, deep interest and affection for land settled by the Dutch, which native inhabitants were subdued, and so forth and so on. He seems to be describing South Africa in the height of apartheid. And then he points out, I refer, of course, to the United States of America, which had the same sort of history. And then he gave this very famous speech. Each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lots of others or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. This is known as his ripple of hope speech. And crossing from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest wall of oppression and resistance. So that notion of a ripple of hope, or the trim tab, or the principle of the vital few, it goes by any number of names, but the idea is the same, that a small number can have a big effect. When Kennedy uttered these words, this man was in prison, and it wasn't long, well, it was a long time, but it wasn't too long after that, 18 years, that he became the president of a free South Africa. And the tides of change all start as tiny ripples. This is just an example I'll give you of, it's kind of like the Greensboro Four. Here's a bunch of students, and they were looking at the situation of their future with climate change, and they decided to go to the courts, and they were in Montana, so they sued the state of Montana for not caring for their future self-interest, because the state was involved in a lot of things oriented towards the use of fossil fuels. And their argument was that basically the state is undermining our future. And they won their case. It's probably going to end up in the Supreme Court, and your guess is as good as mine what's going to happen once it gets there. But these sort of students may be the Greensboro Four of climate change in America down the road. Again, a small number who can have a big effect. Just a few more things to say, and then we'll, have some moments to talk and chat. There's this notion out there called positive deviance, and I really like it. So positive deviance is the idea that, when we think about whether you're dealing with climate change or the impact of social media or an economic situation or any big problem, you scratch your head and it's like, I have no idea what the solution is. And it's like we have to invent a wheel to figure it out. And that's usually false. Usually there are small microcosms where solutions are already worked out and we just haven't found them. That's the notion of positive deviance. Positive deviance is the idea that there's things going on out there that are working. You just have to discover them and then imitate them. And and that imitation can lead to broad-scale change. I think this should work, but I may need tech support here. So I'm going to click on a very brief video. It's by Derek Silvers called How to Start a Movement, and it has a positive deviant in it. Oh, can we? I will let you then try to do that while I continue talking for a moment. So just to rehearse a little bit, we've talked about the age of, let's see, it's Derek Silvers. How to, up one. There he is, How to Start a Movement, right there. No, we'll watch this and I'll finish up afterwards. And of course we get an ad because that's the way these things work.
Tourists taking photos that are analyzed by AI. So researchers can help life underwater flourish.
So ladies and gentlemen, at TED we talk a lot about leadership and how to make a movement. So let's watch a movement happen, start to finish, in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons from it. First, of course you know, a leader needs the guts to stand out and be ridiculed. But what he's doing is so easy to follow. So here's his first follower with a crucial role. He's going to show everyone else how to follow. Now notice that the leader embraces him as an equal. So now it's not about the leader anymore, it's about them, plural. Now there he is calling to his friends. Now if you notice that the first follower is actually an underestimated form of leadership in itself. It takes guts to stand out like that. The first follower is what transforms a lone nut into a leader. And here comes a second follower. Now it's not a lone nut, it's not two nuts, 3 is a crowd, and a crowd is news. So a movement must be public. It's important to show not just the leader, but the followers, because you find that new followers emulate the followers, not the leader. Now here come 2 more people, and immediately after, 3 more people. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point. Now we've got a movement. So notice that as more people join in, it's less risky. So those that were sitting on the fence before now have no reason not to. They won't stand out, they won't be ridiculed, but they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. So over the next minute, you'll see all of the those that prefer to stick with the crowd, because eventually they would be ridiculed for not joining in. And that's how you make a movement. But let's recap some lessons from this. So first, if you are the type, like the shirtless dancing guy, that is standing alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals. So it's clearly about the movement, not you. Okay, but we might have missed the real lesson here. The biggest lesson, if you noticed, did you catch it? Is that leadership is over-glorified. That yes, it was the shirtless guy was first, and he'll get all the credit, but it was really the first follower that transformed the lone nut into a leader. So as we're told that we should all be leaders, that would be really ineffective. If you really care about starting a movement, have the courage to follow and show others how to follow. And when you find a lone nut doing something great, have the guts to be the first one to stand up and join in. And what a perfect place to do that, TED. Thanks.
So that the first shirtless dancer is your positive deviant. And the first follower then is the person who figures out a way to translate positive deviance into something that can actually be effective. That's all right. I'm doing this so much faster than I could have done it. Yeah, close enough. I'll get right to there. There we go. So how quick can change be? I spend a little bit more time with my students on this, but I'll just mention another term. This comes not so much from the social sciences, natural sciences. It's called phase transitions. The best example of this is crystallization. When water turns into ice, is that a slow process? Not really. When the water is the right temperature, or just less than the right temperature, it's a complete liquid. It's a very cold liquid. And then it quickly crystallizes. The best example I've found of this is I was traveling once, and they were making sugar. And when they make sugar, they've got a big vat, and it's in liquid form. And then they seed the vat with some sugar crystals. And so you've got this big vat of liquid sugar. They'll throw in some sugar crystals, and just goes through the whole vat, and it all crystallizes virtually instantaneously. That's a phase transition where you get a radical change in a very short time because the system is primed for that. So you can look at a social situation and it may look like things are never going to change, and then things can change very quickly. Again, think about the Greensboro Four. You had a history of a nation born with slavery and apartheid and racial injustice sewn into its very roots. And in 3 short years, you had this phase transition where you have a complete shift in the nation's orientation. So, options for action: serve as a trim tab and utilize key leverage points. Set a personal example and create a ripple of hope. Find a positive deviant and become a catalytic follower. And live in hope of being at a time when a phase transition is likely. And I will leave it there, and we can have a discussion in the minutes that remain. I look forward to it.
Well, thank you very much. One of the problems, of course, is that the reverse can also happen. I can remember saying, oh, I think that green thinking, green approach, this was a few years ago, just a few years ago, the green, Florida is now a green state. Yeah, well, there we are. Did you want to?
Thank you for an interesting presentation, which was very positive, optimistic, and kumbaya. But you don't, I missed your class, you don't discuss the forces of opposition, sometimes very powerful and very dark, which these students must contend with. Do you ever prepare them for that?
Yeah, so in the class, I have a brief section I showed you about the anti-sustainability movement, that liken it to the United Nations taking over the world and black helicopters circling us and herding us into pens. I talk about that, and I talk about some of the other things. I will acknowledge that it's challenging, especially today, I would say especially in the state of Florida, to talk about some of these things because we live in a polarized nation. And if you're talking about sustainability and environmental caretaking, that is also polarized in the sense of there's one political party that is primarily an advocate for it. I have lots to criticize the Democrats in terms of their type of advocacy for it. And there's one political party that by and large isn't. And so it's challenging in a classroom to talk about this in a way that doesn't bring partisan politics into it, because that can be pretty disruptive. But yeah, I do spend a fair bit of time. I talk a lot about greenwashing, which is the effort to sort of paint yourself green. Like corporations do this a lot, so do governments. They paint themselves green, pretending to be on that side, but all the while they're just acting in sort of base self-interest. We spent some time talking about that.
Spraying themselves.
Yeah, spraying themselves green, right? And we do talk about some of the, well, you know, I mean, an example is just fossil fuel companies, right? If you're going to effectively grapple with climate change, you're going to have to leave much of the coal and oil that is in the ground in the ground. Those are dollars in the ground. Those are billions of dollars in the ground that are there just waiting to be dug up and to be put in people's pockets. And one is arguing they should be left in the ground. So there's a lot of opposition to this sort of stuff, for sure. But, you know, there's hopeful things even on that side to tell, fortunately. So solar and wind now are cheaper to put online and to produce electricity than coal is, and are becoming cheaper than even fossil fuels, because there's gaining access to fossil fuels is getting more costly. So there's things that you can talk about in a factual way that suggests that there's hope for doing things in a way that preserves the environment.
We have a question on Zoom. Shirley, go ahead.
Hello, this is very, very interesting, a little bit discouraging. I would like to suggest that the concept of unintended consequences is sometimes evident after a while, like the Chinese who intended to control their population by reducing birth control, and now they have had to try to reconstruct their public by changing those laws. And we also, the success of birth control around the world, now the opposite is happening in our own country even. The backlash, discovering unintended consequences can be great sometimes.
Yeah, thanks for that. So happens I wrote a book on unintended consequences. It's called Indra's Net and the Midas Touch. And the Midas Touch refers to King Midas, who asked the gift of the gods that he would be able to turn anything he touched into gold. And that worked out really well because he became the richest man in all the land until he sat down at a feast and tried to eat a grape, and it broke his tooth because it had turned into gold, and he couldn't drink because it turned into metal. And then he hugged his child and she turned into solid metal, and he realized he'd die of starvation with no family around him. So he asked the god to take back the gift, and the god was good enough to do so. So yeah, unintended consequences are huge. I think the answer to that is to suggest that we engage in the literature. It's called adaptive management. But the idea is that we have to look at politics like we look at science. It's experimental. And you want to create what we call safe to fail experiments. You want to try something in a small scale and see if it works, and then scale it out to make it better. Unfortunately, that's kind of a non-starter politically, right? Like, who is going to vote for someone who says, I would like to experiment with your lives? Right? They vote for people who say, I have the answer, or who say, I'm the only person who has the answers. So, but the reality is we don't know enough not to experiment. We just don't have enough knowledge to go about this in a way that doesn't include experimentation and building on the things that work. And again, that's the notion of positive deviance. There's people, there's groups out there, there's people out there that on a small scale are doing things that work. We have to find those places and those people and then emulate that and scale it up because we're not wise enough to do anything else.
Basically, very positive. Thank you so much.
50 years ago, there was major concerns about rapid population growth. And a lot of people thought that was maybe the most important issue we faced. And there were concerns about the sustainability of human life. And since that time, population growth rates have dropped steadily. I think they're under 1% a year now. And I think I read recently that 2/3 of the world population lives in countries with below replacement fertility. And projections are showing many are showing population to peak in 30 or 40 years, maybe at another 1 or 2 billion. So my question would be, do you view this approach of zero population growth and then possibly population decline as one potential benefit in terms of sustainability?
Yeah, it's a complex question. So yeah, you're right. We're at about 8 billion people on this planet right now. We're probably going to get up to 9.5, 10 billion before we plateau, and then it's going to slowly start to come down. So here's the thing, though. If you would have asked people, so when we were all teenagers, and there were, 3 to 4 billion people on the earth, if you would have said then, well, is it a problem that you're only going to have twice this many people on the earth? You worry about, the population falling to 3 or 4 billion, which is to say less than half of what we are today. We would have said, no, there's plenty of people. We don't need that. We don't need double or triple the amount of people. So a lot of the hype around, oh, we're losing population, it's a big problem, that has to do with the way we structure our economies, with the idea that you have to have economic growth, otherwise, the show's over. And you have to have economic growth because corporations need their shareholders to invest, and the shareholders want to make sure there's 7 or 8 or 9% growth minimum each year, and that's what it's based on. But I think we have to understand how narrow a historical viewpoint that is. Societies existed for thousands of years that weren't based on endless economic growth or endless population growth or endless any growth. They were stable societies, what Herman Daly called a steady state economy. So, I think we need to change our thinking and move towards something that's much more like a steady state economy. You can increase prosperity and welfare without increasing economic growth in the sense of what Daly calls throughput. Throughput is the things you take out of the ground, go through the mill, produce at the other end. The way we've got growth up till this point has been by increasing throughput. And the problem is increasing throughput destroys the environment and puts carbon in the air. So we've got to figure out a way to maintain prosperity without increasing throughput, without simply manufacturing and throwing out more and more things. And there's no reason we can't do that. In fact, we've been doing that for 10,000 years before the last 2 centuries rolled along, and we decided to do things differently. But again, it's going back and finding out things that work and emulating them and working on that. And that's going on, right now in a number of different ways. But it's going to change. It's going to take some fairly radical shifts. And going back to the other question, there's going to be opponents to it because, put it this way, environmental destruction makes a lot of people a lot of money.
I wonder if you might comment about the parallel path between social activism and I work in the natural science field, and there are tipping points that sometimes, the water quality gets a little bit less and then all the seagrass dies and then the manatees die. Or in the Amazon, there's talk now that by cutting so many trees, it is the trees that contribute to the moisture in the atmosphere to create their rainforest, that those tipping points, there are tipping points socially, and then there are tipping points in scientific wise. So a small social effect might have a huge science effect or change in climate or views there. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. And at the start of the Q&A, Jane mentioned that, most of my examples, or all of my examples, are about good tipping points, the Greensboro Four or the end of apartheid in South Africa. But there are bad tipping points. There are bad phase transitions where things are going along and they seem fairly stable and all of a sudden things crash. One of the more infamous examples is, again, going back to when we were young, we used to eat a lot of cod because cod was abundant on the whole eastern seaboard. And then in the early 80s, they hit a tipping point, and all of a sudden the cod industry just collapsed completely. There was virtually no cod to be found, and those villages went kind of bankrupt, and only now is it starting to come back, and no one saw it coming. They were increasing the amount of cod they took out, but there seemed always more there. And then all of a sudden a tipping point happened. And you have this big time with climate change where, unfortunately, we don't even know how close we are to the tipping points or whether we're actually beyond the tipping points and haven't just got the data yet to show us that. So this does go back to that, I think, for me, the same notion of the humility we have to have, why we need to experiment because we don't know enough not to. Likewise, we have to have the humility to know that there's all sorts of tipping points out there that we have not yet understood. And so, the notion that you are going to push forward, sort of, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, because there's nothing really bad happening right now is just foolhardy. We have to understand that there's all sorts of natural tipping points that we have to be wary of, and we have to be doing the science to find out where they are so that we don't, go off a cliff. As one person said, running towards a cliff at full speed, the thing is, the view is just getting better and better. And then it's over, right? But that's where we're in, where the view seems to be getting better and better. And so let's just keep going at full speed.
Is positive deviance a euphemism for progressives or revolutionaries?
Do I have
Is positive deviance
yes?
a euphemism for progressives or revolutionaries?
No, I don't think so. Everything I say here, I think, can be understood in a fairly nonpartisan manner, in the sense of you could have a positive deviant that is very conservative in orientation. So, earlier on, there was the question of unending economic growth, and I made the comment that, we know how to do it otherwise. We could just imitate what human beings have been doing for about 9,000 years, rather than doing what we've been doing in the last 200 years. Well, that would be a conservative approach. That'd be saying, well, let's go back to something we used to do that we no longer do. So it's not it sounds revolutionary because now everybody's on the wagon to unending economic growth, but it's really a conservative orientation. And I'd note that, as people in the natural sciences always say, that the root of environmental conservation is conserve. So I'd want to say that environmentalism, to the extent that it's interested in conservation, is a conservative movement by definition.
You are, you're in a group here of older people, yes, but a lot of brain power, and you might think of us as kind of one of your classes. And do you have any specific suggestions for a group like this to become trim tabs in a certain way, experiment in a certain way, and you might even come back and think of us as a pool of possibility and come back with some suggestions?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate that. And there's a lot of students out there with a lot of energy that don't have a connection. apart from perhaps maybe in their families, to different generations. And I think there could be some wonderful synergy there between youth and retirees.
Okay, my question is back to environmental, and one of the subjects is electric vehicles. Oh, is this better? Electric vehicles, supposedly the savior of us all. Maybe yes, maybe no. As you pointed out, we don't know where the tipping point is. Is it coming or is it going? It's probably coming. I'd like you to comment on that, especially in the fact that those who control fossil fuels are probably part of the 20% of the ownership of the fossil fuels, maybe more like the 10% or the 5%, quite honestly.
Right.
And so my question to you is, could you comment on how you feel that the electric vehicles will contribute to the lessening of our problem, or will be the savior of this problem? I don't know. I think they will be helpful.
I think they'll be helpful. To say that they'll save us is, I think, going a little too far. Electrification of transportation is going to be crucial, but transportation isn't even the major contributor to carbon in the atmosphere. You have a lot of other things going on, which has to do with buildings, which has to do with industry, which has to do with agriculture. And so, I think the best way to think about this is, there's a pie, there's slices of the pie. We have to figure out how to remake each of those slices. Electric vehicles will help with one slice of that pie, and then there's a lot to be done around the rest of the pie to make this actually work. And with electric vehicles, it's the major manufacturers are all getting behind it because that's where there's going to be money to be made. And there's problems that go with it. We have to get much better at the battery technology. But that's going to happen in time. That'll happen. Whether it's quick enough or not, I don't know. But that's going to be, a major help if we get there. But we can't do that with the idea that that's going to save us, because it's not enough of the carbon pie to do that.
I have a question on greenhouse gases, and that I've heard of a couple of different things, especially coming from animal rights and vegan individuals. There's a strong movement now to go in that direction, and they're saying that I think 30 to 40% of carbon emissions come from cattle raising. But I remember hearing a talk maybe 4 or 5 years ago on greenhouse emissions, and the figure they had was, I think, 10% or less coming from cattle. So I was wondering what the truth is, where we are on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. My students had this argument just this year, because you can find virtually any figure on the internet, and my understanding is it's somewhere between 10 and 20% that comes from agriculture, and it's not as if vegetarian or vegan diets are carbon free, right? If you go into a store and you buy your package of spinach, if you drive to the store in your fossil fuel vehicle, buy your package of spinach wrapped in plastic that was produced in California and shipped over to the store, there's a carbon footprint for that. So, if we were all growing our own gardens, a vegan diet or a vegetarian diet would be a wonderful way to take 15% of carbon out of the equation right away. That's not going to happen right away, but it's a big, significant chunk. Just like electric vehicles instead of fossil fuel vehicles, a diet that is lower in meat and especially lower in ruminants. Those are the animals that fart out methane. That would make a big difference. Sheep is a big problem. Cattle is a big problem. Yeah, the question is it all agriculture that's the problem? And the short of it is you know, if you have fossil fuel vehicles in large agribusiness areas, and you're applying lots of fertilizer, which is nitrogen fertilizer, and nitrous oxides go into the air, and that's a greenhouse gas. And that food gets shipped all over the country, then yeah, there's a huge carbon impact from agriculture, generally speaking. But the highest impact generally comes from ranching, from cattle and sheep and that's for two reasons. One is because of what comes out of their back end, the methane, and the other is what goes in their mouths. To this day, there's large amounts of forests in South America that are being razed, that are being burned down so that they can either graze cattle on that land or can produce crops to feed cattle, soybeans and that sort of stuff. So when you think about it, if you're taking a lot of trees out of the equation, producing a lot of soybeans, feeding all that to cattle very inefficiently, and then feeding that cattle to human beings, that's a very carbon intensive form of agriculture.
Well, thank you very much. Very interesting. Thanks so much.